All right, so here's the main event. This is a presentation that I gave last month to the BC Community Forest Association conference. We figured since only a couple of people in this room would have got to see it, we should share it with our members and guests. So it will have a forestry theme. As you can see, it's called Once Upon a Tree, Forestry Through Time in the Arrow Lakes. And of course, you can't talk about forestry in the Arrow Lakes without the original residents of the Arrow Lakes, the Nakusp people. This is an iconic shot that's we've been fortunate enough to be able to share with a lot of different groups now. This is from the Burt Heritage collection, and a lot of his photos around 1907, 1908, both on our lakes and on neighboring lakes. We don't know exactly if this is Arrow Lakes or not, or a adjacent lake, but it's a really, really important shot in our history. Of course, the very canoe that you see in this photo is forestry, right? That comes from trees. This is at Nakusp. This is right on Kuskanak's Point, 1907. And it's stunning to think that right now that this is basically just desert covered in snow, this location in this photo. That is the first ever photo of the Nakusp town site, 1892. There aren't even any buildings in it yet. They're leveling the waterfront. In fact, they're taking wood to load onto a stern wheeler in this photo. Think of the top of the hill, and that's about where the Leland is. So the first big employers in Nakusp were the shipyard and the mill. Shipyard, everything's built of wood. All the boats, all the firewood used to power the boats, because a lot of them weren't necessarily coal-powered. And so we needed the mill, and what's the perfect location for the mill? The place where the marina is now. This is the Janelle mill in 1897. And yeah, it's basically right on top of where the marina and the wharf are now. So it's always, right from the beginning, the waterfront of Nakusp is hot. The Janelle family slowly expanded their empire across southern BC. This is their mill at Wesley, and Wesley becomes the default location for every single mill that follows it right up till now, where it's basically the location of the Celgar mills. And which is why eventually the Janelle family winds up at that end of the lake, and how you get the town of Janelle. This is Summit Lake town site, and yes, there was an actual town site at Summit Lake, about where the Camp Valhalla, former Three Islands Resort, is now. But for about 15 years, there was a small village there, Company Town. As with so many towns back then, it was lost to fire at the beginning of the 1920s. If you know All's House Road in Summit Lake and All's House Peak, at the edge of Box Mountain there, that's named after Tom Alshouse, who was the co-owner of the mill and the town site. Summit Lake Lumber Company specialized in poles. You'll notice as you drive past Box Lake going towards Summit Lake, all those tall, skinny trees. Well, the first growth of those trees, the original old growth, were perfect for poles. And so West Kootenay in general was prime location for making poles. In fact, it was West Kootenay poles that were used in the first Yankee Stadium. It was West Kootenay poles that used to be shipped across to London for the giant Christmas trees on display. Some of these were 80, 100 feet high. So this is a ship of poles going from Summit Lake to England. And of course, it's not just Nakusp, right? We're talking all up and down the valley. Here's Bill Hopp and the Hopp Brothers truck in Edgewood with exactly 8 tree trunks on it because the trees were that big. As you can see, a very secure load. Nothing could possibly go wrong. And if you want to know why they call the old Edgewood town site Dump Beach, because that's where the log dump was, and that's where this photo's taken. Here's camp life, right? Back then, anything that would have been more than 6-7 kilometers out of town, they'd start up a logging camp. and they just stay out there. This is too much of a hassle to get back to town, especially in the days before automobiles. So people just lived in the logging camp, and Summit City was essentially one giant logging camp. And so you have whimsical photos like these, but just look at the size of the stump that they are posing on. It's pretty amazing. This is the Carlson Mill. The Carlson Mill is a successor to the Janelle Mill, and one thing you'll notice here is the amount of South Asian mill workers in this photo. Up until the 1920s, Nakusp had a very large Sikh population. Anywhere between 1 and 2 dozen Sikh mill workers, South Asian mill workers, working in Nakusp at any one time. Here's a casual shot. This is a famous Matty Gunterman glass slide. This is just loggers having lunch in the woods between Beaton and Camborne. Nice casual shot. And of course, at this point, it's horse logging, right? So you see the horses in the front. Going up the lake, the biggest mill, bigger than any mill in Nakusp, was it went through a number of different names. Eventually, it was the Dominion Sawmill, Forest Mills. But this was the mill that was the bread and butter of the town of Comaplex, which was on the Beaton Arm, halfway between Arrowhead and Beaton. Comaplex was quite a growing concern. Unfortunately, World War I happens. And when World War I happens, the company that owns the mill is headquartered in Britain. And because of the volatility of the shipping lanes during the war, they're worried about being able to access their actual timber. And so they just decide, screw it, we'll take the insurance. Yeah. Yeah, it's the same root word, yeah. So like the Incomaplex River comes out at Beaton, and so if you keep going another 8 kilometers, 10 kilometers. It's called complex, not Incomaplex. Yeah, it's just called Comaplex, yeah, just those 8. Yeah. So if you know where the Haddo Creek campsite is, just go another 2K west of that. And that's about what a town. At low water, you can still see the remnant of the old town, because that's all that's left after this fire that was intentionally started, shall we say. All of the fire hoses were cut in town the night before. They wanted the mill gone so they could claim the insurance, and they wound up taking the entire town. And the SS Revelstoke, which happened to be docked on the waterfront. And it's that paddle that is out in front of the visitor center now. It was embedded in the beach for 71 years until took it out of the beach, and they barged it all the way down and then installed it in front of the brand new Chamber of Commerce building. Yeah. I mentioned the Nelsons before. I mentioned John Nelson Sr. and then John Nelson. This is the son, also named John Nelson, with his brother Walter. And here they are horse logging on their property at Galena Bay in the 1930s. Very cool shot. Galena Bay is most famous in logging terms for being the home of a log railway. Arrow Lakes Lumber Company, which was based out of Arrowhead, actually built a 6-mile-long railway from up in the mountains where all the timber was down to their logging camp on the shores of Galena Bay, and then from there they would ship it out across the Beaton Arm to Arrowhead. But they actually built their own railway, complete with a real proper steam engine and everything. The trestle that they built for this railway stood in the forest. The railway itself went from like 1906 to the middle of 1900s, and then it was just abandoned, left in the woods. But the trestle that they built was there for another 100 years afterwards. It only glued down finally a couple of years ago. Fortunately, we've got lots of photos and video of it standing in the woods. Jerry, who took that photo? So one on the left is Jerry's photo, and then Bill Watts, the famous folklore historian who built the castle. That's his photo on the right. But yeah, this was there right until a few years ago. And look at all the trees that grew up around it and through it. We talked about Watchand Lake. Well, that tunnel wasn't the first connection between Watchand Lake and the Lower Arrow Lake. The Waldy brothers built a giant log flume from Watcham Lake all the way down to Needles in the 1910s. So by the time logs came down off that flume into the lake, they were traveling about 60 kilometers per hour as they slammed into the water. Yeah. A couple decades later, you get the Lindsley brothers. Anybody know where Wings live? Right as you come into Edgewood and then you turn? Instead of turning into Edgewood, you just turn left towards the old town site, and they're the first house there. That is where this tunnel is. On the left, that's right behind Upper and Oakland Falls, which constantly log jammed. Where the Ewing's farm is now, where the property is now, that was a log pond. And so, as they tried to float all this stuff from the log pond down through the 2 sets of falls to get to the lake, they realized it's just impossible. So they actually blasted a tunnel around the falls. And that tunnel is still there today. And you can walk right through it. So when you don't have the money to build your own railways, most logging outfits, they all build their own railways, right? No, you've got to improvise. And so this is usually what would happen. A fore and aft road. You just build tracks out of logs so that your primitive logging trucks and wagons could actually traverse all the mud and all the crap on the ground. And that's how you got your timber to your log dump so then you could ship it to the market. So this is up at Twin Lakes, up behind Nakusp East Road. Yeah. This is down on the waterfront. For newer residents, anybody that doesn't remember before 1970, picture the Nakusp Public Beach and the land right below the cemetery. That's where this is. And this is the White Pine, predecessor of Big Bend Lumber, which then got merged into Celgar. 1936, and this is about 1 million feet of red cedar. Yeah. There's an aerial view of the mill, 1960. So you think of that waterfront walkway sort of curving around. I mentioned the beach because when they first constructed the beach in 1970, they hadn't figured out the breakwater part. And so after about 2 years, all the sand that they brought in swept away into the lake, and it just uncovered all the sawdust from the old mill. So they had to bring in more sand, and then they built those riprap barriers to trap more sand. And then they got it right. Now we have a pretty nice beach. But this mill site was the prime employer in Nakusp for about 35 years, from the mid-1920s right up until the mill closed in 62. A lot of the labor in that mill came from the camps, the Japanese-Canadian internment camps down in Lemon Creek, Roseberry, New Denver, and Sandon. A lot of the people who were interned there were well experienced in the lumber industry, working on the coast, working on Vancouver Island. When people like Sid Leary and other mill owners found this out, they knew that they had reliable labor in these camps. And so a lot of the Japanese families that wound up staying in Nakusp came because they found employment in the Big Bend Mill. So, and when you think that 5%, 6% of the entire population of this town is Japanese Canadian, and we owe a lot of that to forestry. That's the beehive burner on the waterfront, and you look in the back, and this is at high water, 1955. Obviously, before the dam, we have tons of problem with flooding, and this is 55 was a flood year. So you can look at Nakusp in the background, and then you can see the entire beehive burner surrounded by water. Heading back up north, Arrowhead. That's what the Arrowhead town site looks like in 1906-ish. Right before the fire kind of wipes out the town and they rebuild. So you have the bunkhouses where the mill workers left on the right, and then the mill in the middle, and then the main Arrowhead town site on the left. And you can see it's quite a going concern. You get later on to Arrowhead. This is the ferry landing at Arrowhead, the second ferry landing. And you see the beehive burner from the Arton lumber mill was right at the end. And of course, that's also the end of the railway coming down from Revelstoke. On the top right, you see a photo taken by Dr. Maxfield from the Minto on its last sailing, 1954. John Nelson is posing next to his banner, advocating for the continued reinstatement of the Minto right in front of the Arton lumber sign. And then that's a shot from inside the mill. And again, you just see the size of the trees back then. Once we get into the 60s, everything starts heading south towards the big Celgar pulp mill in the 50s and 60s. And this is a great shot from Ed Wanstall. Of course, they'd have to do these big, giant river drives all the way from the top end of the Big Bend all the way through Revelstoke, down to Nakusp, down through all the way to Castlegar, later even through the locks of the dam down to Castlegar. And so you'd have these 300-kilometer-long river drives towing all these giant log booms. Well, the Columbia River, of course, lots of sandbars. Sometimes wood gets loose, logs, you got to free them off the sandbar. And this is an example of how you free a log off of a sandbar. You drive a cat, and you just push it off. Sometimes you drive too far. And of course, that's the stretch of the river back then between Revelstoke and Blanket Creek, right? So that's where you have the shallowest water. Here's a more successful log boom. You just see the size of these log booms towing everything. And just these little tugs doing it too. That's what a log boom looks like going through the dam. Because of course the pulp mill and the sawmill are on the other side of the dam. So they had to account for that when they built it. Other things you shouldn't do while cruising for timber. Don't feed bears. This is right across the lake. Basically, if you were to draw a straight line across the lake from the Nakusp waterfront, right there, right around Vipon Creek. But yeah, in some of my other shows where I showed the movies, you actually see the... That's John Swanson? Yeah. Somewhere back in that tug, there's also a DeBoney. There was a Roy Churchill's possibly on that tug as well. But yeah, so that's John Swanson himself feeding the bear. Here we go. And yeah, so we actually have motion color footage of this as well. Nowadays, everything's built around tree farm licenses, and of course, that coincided with the consolidation of the lumber industry. Tree farm license 23. The first silviculture project was embarked upon in 57. So Nelson Walden, if you remember him, he planted the first tree in tree farm 23. So that's the seedling on the left, and then that's what it grew into on the right. They actually knew exactly where that seedling was planted and took that photo. And of course, Celgar was Columbia Cellulose, then it was Canadian Cellulose, then it was Westar, then it was BC Timber, then it was Westar, then it was Pope and Talbot, and now it's Interval. That, obviously, is a malfunction of this slideshow. That is supposed to be a photo of Henry Marcoli and Ken Stewart logging up Barnes Creek. I'm glad the top quarter of that photo turned out. You can see a red photo negative if you stare closely. Yeah, and the one on, hey, the photo on the right didn't even show up. There we go. That photo thankfully turned out. This is a shot from Gene Spicer's massive slide collection, with 1,600 slides. So this is probably a waterfield operation, I'm guessing. Heel boom buncher. This is where my dad worked. This is the Columbia River Shake and Shingle Mill, 1974, out there on delta on the north side of the Goosenax Creek. There used to be 2 big beehive burners out there. Now there's just the one. But this was a pretty solid employer for Nakusp for about 20 years. It burned down the year it was built, and they rebuilt it right back. Here's a sort of solemn one. I mentioned at the beginning of the show, we see that big, huge pile of log poles heading out for England. Well, here's the last log poles to go out on train from Nakusp, from the pole yard behind the Esso there. The 7th of February, 1988. The final load of poles by train. And then, of course, December 88 is when they actually shut it down, and then the next year they tear it up. This is the Sanders Brothers operation, northwest of Revelstoke, skyline logging. So aerial suspension logging.
It was the brothers and their dad.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. This is Marilyn's photo. Marilyn actually wrote an article for Forest Practice Canada on this operation. That's where this photo comes from. And of course, all of that helped contribute to the town we have today. So there you go, a nice little aerial image of Nakusp and surroundings to go out on. That's my show, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.